Hello again, this is Point On Pally, and welcome to part 3 of the Making a Character Rig series. And in this part, we will start with the building of the blend shapes for the ribbon rig. But before I do that, I wanted to make a little tweak to the ribbon rig and kind of make a note about this video and the series overall. And that point is, I want to keep this video series as structured as I can, so we kind of have a clear kind of progression with this series as it goes on, that we don't get too sidetracked and kind of go off the rails. But one thing I want to make a note of is when I build rigs, especially like my own personal rigs, I often get ideas and I'm often inspired as I go. Most of the videos on my channel have come across just rigging a character, and part of that rigging process inspired me in some way to build something else. And so that is probably going to happen during this video series, where I might say I'm finished with something, but I get an idea after recording the video, or something that kind of sparks my interest, or something that I think would make this video series and this rig better as I do them. So that's one thing I want to keep in mind, and that is what we're going to do for the start of this video. Is we're going to add a little tweak to the tentacle, specifically the bend here, because as it currently stands, when I lift this, you can see that the tentacle bends. But one thing I noticed when I started doing this bend is it's a little narrow. What if an animator wanted to create kind of a rounder bend here, and not necessarily just a very like short bend? So if I wanted to increase that bend, how would I go about doing that? Well, we're going to use a lot of the existing setup that we already have here for the tentacle bend. We're just going to create a couple of additional attributes. If I bring up the node editor here, we're going to create a couple of additional attributes to connect everything in. So we're going to connect into the value adjust here from the plus minus average, and we'll connect all that in so that we can get not only a bend here for the tentacle for these kind of in-between controls, but an adjustable one. So we'll put an attribute on the tentacle icon here, probably just a tentacle bend attribute or something to that effect. In fact, so we're actually going to create that attribute really quick before we move on to all of this in the node editor. So I'm just going to add attribute. We'll call this tentacle in between bend, something like that. Get all the consonants in there. All right, 0, 10. All right. So what we're going to do now is connect everything together so we can eventually funnel it into the in-between controls here. So where we want to be is right around here in this value adjust, because that's where we actually kind of multiply the value so that the control here goes up, and so that's where we're going to connect everything in. So to start with, I'm going to set these to a lower value because I don't want the in-between controls here to move as much as the middle control, so that we get a kind of an arc here as opposed to these sticking way too far out, which would be the case. So we're going to plug the output 1D of the plus minus average here into each of these input ones, if Maya will let me. There we go. And at this point, since we have all three inputs covered, instead of just using the individual outputs, I'm just going to take the entire output here and plug it into the color if true of the condition.
That's good to go. So now we're going to take the entire out color and plug it into the input 1 of the on-off multiply divide here. And we're going to take the on-off out value from the set range and plug that in to each of the input 2's here. Since it's an on-off, we don't have to worry about adjusting any values here. It's the same value. And then we can actually take the middle pad here of that control icon, so I'm selecting pad 1 right there. We're going to go ahead and add these to the graph. And we'll plug these into the translate Y, just like we did the main control. So let's try that just to see how it works. Translate Z goes into the other translate Y, or output Z into the other translate. Alright, so let's see how that looks. Alright, so you can see that's a little much here. We're almost getting too much of an arc with this. So I might want to decrease those, decrease the values a little bit. So let's try halving that number. Let's see what we get at negative 0.5. And you know what we can do is, since we have this attribute here, what we can do is actually leave this at negative 1 and have the attribute this in-between bend attribute here. What we can do is actually just key this on and off with the value here. So instead of having a separate one, and we could have theoretically done it for this one too. Yeah, but we use the set range since we already have it here, and there's nothing going on in the other values here for this. So I'll just plug this into value Z here. And what I can do is say, all right, old min is 0, old max is 10. And this always trips me up when we're dealing with negative numbers here. Because my first instinct is the minimum Z is 0 and the max Z is negative 1. So we'll try that. I'm pretty sure that the lowest number has to be the minimum. But we'll test this and just see how it looks. So if we connect this and we get, since the attribute itself right now is at 0, if we plug this in to the value just here and the input 2's here are 0, then we know it's working. So let's plug this in. Out value Z into input 2Y. Say flip to 0. That's a good sign. And output 2Z. Alright. So it looks like it's back to normal there on the bend. But if I adjust this attribute, there we go. So we get a little bit more of a bend here. And the nice thing is that the main tentacle bend attribute we'll turn it all off regardless of what the in-between bend is doing. And we can adjust how much of an arc we want in the bend. We don't necessarily have to have it all the way at the max. We can have just a slight addition there, but it's giving us a little bit of an extra control there, which is what I wanted. And again, it's kind of the idea with this was just to kind of add a little extra something that I wanted to try as far as an idea. That's kind of the idea we're going for here. All right, so now that we've finished that, so the main ribbon is done officially. So before we get into building the blend shapes and stuff, what I want to do is just clean up this outliner right now. Right now, this outliner, there's a lot in here. And the OCD person in me really wants to clean this up before we move on to blend shapes, because the blend shapes are going to make this even more clogged in the outliner than it needs to be. So we're going to do a little bit of cleanup at first. So the follicles, what I like to do with the follicles, since they don't really fall under I don't like putting them in the rig group because typically I like to connect this for making the rig scalable, and the follicles don't need to be scaled. So what we might do is create a new group, and I'll just call this follicles group. And it'll be its own kind of separate group in here, and we'll parent the follicles, because we're going to have a lot of follicle groups in here with all the ribbons that we're going to use in the tentacles and the body and the arms as well, and the neck. So there's going to be a lot of follicle groups, so might as well make a separate group, or separate from everything else, so we can kind of stick everything in there. Alright, so we have the controls in here. And so what I'm going to do is, at least for right now, what I'm going to plug those is under the center of gravity icon. Actually, I'm just going to plug these under the master control icon. So I'm going to parent these right under the move all control here. And the reason for that is, I think what I'm going to do is the center of gravity is going to be separate from the tentacles. It's not going to move the entire body. That's what this move all icon is going to be for. The center of gravity will be able to pick up the torso of the body, and the tips of the tentacles are going to stay planted. So that's the idea here. So I'm going to keep them parented under the move all control, and I'm also going to parent the center of gravity icon as well. And while I'm at it, oh, well, I was going to color the icon, but since it's parented under the move all icon, which has the color that we need, I'll just do it just to make sure. Alright, so that control is colored, and the individual tentacle icon, I'm going to parent that under the center of gravity. So that clears up the controls. These are the joints for the ribbon. So those are going to go under the rig pad. And then there's the locators. So what I'm going to do for this, this is going to go under the rig group, but we're going to create a locators pad. Just so I can kind of keep these a little bit separate from the rest of the joints, and I have like an identifying group to let me know where all the locators are going to be for the rig. Now the ribbon, there's a couple of options that we can go here. We can either parent it into the hierarchy, but in order to do that, we would have to turn inherent transforms off. But since it's already bound to the joints, we don't really have to put it inside the hierarchy. We can kind of leave it on its own. So what I think I'm going to do, at least in the meantime, sorry about that error, is I'm just going to call this the ribbons pad. And I'm going to keep the ribbons kind of in their own separate pad here. So this is how it's organized currently. So I have a follicles group, a ribbons pad. If I wanted to, I could kind of merge these together if I felt like it. But so this is what we got for right now. So we got it nice and clean. And in the meantime, I'm going to hide the locators. All right, and I'm going to turn off the polygons for right now. And so at this point, we can get started with the blend shapes. All right, to start with, we're going to duplicate the geometry. Mark selected here, move this over. All right, so we can kind of, we'll try and keep this as organized as possible so we don't run into the problems with the organization that we did last time. So what I'm going to do is we're going to create a group for each setup so that we can kind of organize the blend shape setup here. So we'll call this CT tent 1 we'll call this FK blend pad. I'll just duplicate this a few times. So so this group is going to be for the, actually I'll call this FK B shape. The blend can be a confusing word. So we have B shape pad here, and I'm going to try and remember what we had as far as blend shape. So we had an FK setup. We had, call this sine V shape for the sine wave. We've got twists, so the twist deformer. We got squash and stretch. We've got it's not a roll deformer, but it's doing the rolling effect, the coiling effect. So I'm just going to call this roll. It's a bend deformer, but I'm just going to call it roll. Now, I think that's all we needed were these 5. Now, we're going to actually have 2 different sine waves, but 2 different sine wave blend shapes, one for the up and down and one for the side to side, but they don't really take up a lot of space, so we'll keep them in here. Squash and stretch, I might split up into 2, because we are going to have 2 different types of squash and stretch setups. We're going to have one that's going to squash and stretch the whole thing as it moves, in and outward here, and we'll also have a second squash and stretch that squashes and stretches from the middle here. So if I were to move this control out here, this area would squash and this area would stretch. So I'll have kind of 2 different ones. So I'll call this squash stretch 1, and I'll call this one squash stretch 2. All right, so these are the 6 pads that we're going to use for our setup here. And so this one, we'll call this the FK shape geo. And then we'll make sure we parent this one underneath the pad here. So there we go. So at this point, we can start to create the setup for the FK. So we'll, since we have the FK first, we'll set up the FK first. All right, so we'll just create the joint system for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a point for where I want the joints, and then place the joints based on those points. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move this over so it's right in line with that grid mark there. That. So the easiest thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a locator for the points, and I'm going to try and stick to every third edge loop to keep the joint system even here. So that should give me like 6 or 7 different points here. So I'm going to duplicate this, make another one, and I'm just going to keep going every third edge loop. There we go. And a big reason of why I moved this over to 1 is now I can just take all of these locators, move this to 1, and boom, they're right in the middle and right at that set of edge loops. So I now have like the perfect position for where I'm going to place the joints. So let's make them. So I'm just going to hold down V and snap right on those points. And there we go. We have the joint systems placed exactly where we want them. Orientation looks good, so that was pretty easy. Now I can just delete these locators, and we've got our joint system in the exact spot that we want them. So we'll name these first. So I'll start by naming each and every one of these. Do we have a tool for this? I think I do. That's the only thing that I wish I changed about this. Is that I had this tool name it bind and trash because it's a little bit of an older tool, but it still works well. So I'll just do a quick search and replace. There we go. Trying to remember where search and replace is. I believe it's changed. Yeah, modify search and replace names. So I'll just say underscore binds underscore list. The same thing here, but okay. So there we go. So we've got our joint system here, and my mouse is locking up. There we go. Alright, so now we're going to make our controls. So start by creating the circle here. And instead, I've got a nice handy tool here. Because the normal thing that you would do is you would take the control, you group it twice, select the joint, the icon, you parent constrain it with maintain offset turned off so it snaps there. You delete the constraint, and there you go. Or, and you would do that every single time for every single control. Easier thing, in my opinion, is to make a tool for it. Again, to reinforce how important Python is. So I've got a tool here. Pad type is for icons. It's 2 pads, and I'm going to zero it out, which means it's going to snap there. So select the icon, joint. I'm going to reload the tool. Icon 2, 0. There we go. Alright, that's pretty much it. And we can just do that every single time. Get all these controls here. Control 2, joint, make it control 3, joint, 4, or icon first, then joint. Alright, so we got the controls here. So I didn't name it, the tool didn't name it perfectly, but it got pretty close. So we'll just make some adjustments here. Yeah, it takes the joint name and names it based off of the joint. So this is 2, 3. Super exciting world of naming everything, but it is important. I know it can be kind of tedious, but naming is so crucial when building a rig because it allows you to kind of keep track of everything. So if you have to go back and make changes or fix something, this gives you the making sure everything's named will make everything work out pretty well. So I'm not going to call these icons. Icons, actually, so before we tackle this, before I name these, there's a couple of ways that we could approach the controls from here on out. So we have our icons here. There's two things we can do. We can have a set of icons for the blend shape and a set of icons for the main ribbon and directly connect the rotates from the icons here into the icons over here. That is one method. Or what we could do is just have the icons moved that I have here moved over to the main ribbon and directly connect the rotates into the joints here. Now, you would say that would be easier and makes more sense to just move these over. The one issue that could come from that is, let's say I wanted to have preset set-driven keys for these controls to kind of rotate into, so like I'd have an up and down, a left and right, and a twist, if I wanted to. The problem with that is if there are no controls on the joints here, then I would have to make them, because if they're directly connected into the rotates of the joints, there's nothing above the joint to rotate, so we'd have to make an additional connection here or there. The other idea is I can move these controls over and then directly connect the rotates of the icons and add them together with the rotates of the pad above where we would put those set-driven keys and then directly connect them into the joints. And I think that is what we're going to do here. So and the reason I stopped before I named it icon is because if I was going to make a duplicate set of controls, I would call these controls, but since these are going to be the actual icons here, I'm just going to call these icon for when we eventually move these over on top of the main ribbon here. 5 and 6. And real quick, I'm just going to scale these down a little bit. Though I would like to see how they look at the geometry. Alright, so first things first, I'm going to take all these groups here. I'm going to zero out these translates so that it's over the geometry at this point. Now I want to see how these look, especially the root one here. I may want to change the sizes. The big one, the root one here could be a little bit bigger. Actually, it's pretty good as it is. I don't want it to intersect too much with the other controls here. In fact, that actually works better if I make it smaller. You won't be able to select it from the bottom here, but very rarely you're actually going to be looking at the character from the bottom. So I might actually make it just a little bit bigger like that. And I can start to decrease the size of the rest of these. Just pick off this one. I'll make them kind of vary in size a little bit. Keep going down in size as the tentacle gets thinner and thinner. This one just a little bit smaller. Something like that. There we go. So at this point, make sure we freeze transforms on the icons so that they're nice and clean. And we can start to set up the hierarchy here. So the pad 0 of the 6th icon goes under icon 5, and so on and so forth. Alright, so we got our controls here. Looking good. So next what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bind the blend shape geo to these joints. Skin, bind skin. I think we got default settings here, so that should be good.
Alright, so now that we have the ribbon bound, let's just check everything here just to make sure ribbon is looking good. Probably don't really even have to mess with the weighting on the blend shape here since we have enough joints that the weighting should be pretty smooth throughout, so we really don't have to mess with all that much here. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Let's just check side to side. Yeah, overall looking really solid here. So the next thing I want to do is apply this as a blend shape to the original. So we're going to go to Deform. I'm a little bit old school. I know there is the shape editor here. I know that that's fairly common to use now, but the shape editor has given me nothing but problems. I know you can create the blend shape, and let me just test it just to make sure this is actually working. Yep, so it is working. But I also want to point out the other way, kind of a little bit more old school way, because I will admit this the shape editor has given me nothing but problems, especially when it comes to adding blend shapes to an existing node. It's just been troublesome the entire time. So um, first thing I'm going to do is just rename this really quick before I forget. Um, I'll show you the old school way as well, where you'd select the blend shape plus the original. You're going to deform, blend shape. In the settings here, you would name it whatever you want. And in the advanced settings, you can use pre-deformation. Um, that that will put the blend shape underneath the skin cluster. There used to be under the blend shape settings, there used to be one called front of chain. That has since been taken out, but the front of chain was the preferred one that would actually um, put the blend shape underneath the skin cluster. Automatic pre post deformation after they all put it ahead of the skin cluster, which obviously when that blend shape is active, it completely negates the ribbon setup here. So that's not really what we want. So now that we've got the blend shape active, so what I can do is activate that blend shape. Nothing should change, which is good. And just test to make sure it's working properly. Okay, there you go. All right, so the setup is working. Let's turn that back on. So now what we have to do is connect these controls to the joint system here. Not only the controls, I also want to connect the pads above them as well. Because let's say if I wanted to put on this icon here, like set driven keys, just for a curl, a side to side, and a twist, I would need a padding system for the icons here, which I do have, and I would need to connect that into the joint system. So, and since we opted to not have controls for this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rotations for the icon and the pad, funnel them into a plus minus average node, and take that sum of those two values and plug them into the rotations of the joints. So let's do that real quick. So I'm going to take everything here except the pad zeros. Unpick those. And we're going to go to the node editor. And just quick add these in. One thing I'm not a fan of is how it doesn't organize anything, despite the fact that they are in the proper hierarchy. So FK1, FK1, wow, there it is. And that's the shape node. Okay, so let me just make sure that the shape nodes were included here. Let's get rid of those. And then make sure we kind of organize everything based on number. So there's 6, there's 5, there's 4, 3, 2. Alright, so we got everything here. Now we just need those joints. Let's bring those in as well. These will be organized. And we're just going to take everything, open it up.
All right, and now we can bring in the plus minus average node. Just take this, take out the 1. Okay, there we go. And from here, I'm going to take the rotate of the control pad into input 3D. We use 3D. That's one thing I really am having trouble with as well with later versions of Maya is the node editor reorganizing everything. Even though I've set the settings for it not to do that, it just completely ignores it and does it anyway. So the 3D deals with it includes 3 attributes, so that's why I'm plugging it into there. So we'll take the rotate of the icon as well. In fact, the easiest way that we can do this and make sure everything is working properly, the trick is to actually take everything and pin it there it is, where the pin was. So now that I've pinned all these, they should stay put exactly where they are. So even when we create new nodes. So now I've got the output 3D here, plug that into the rotate there. There we go. I know there's a pin all nodes by default setting right there. The problem is that any new node you create, it'll create it right on top of the previous node. So the nodes will just keep appearing in the exact same spot, and you have to constantly move them, which is annoying. All right, last thing I need to make sure is it should be set to sum on the plus minus average node, which it is. So now we can take these nodes and plug them in. Well, rename this. In fact, we'll make one for each of them. There we got 4. Five. And one more. Okay, so there we go. We got them all. One thing I would want to make sure is to make sure these are all pinned. There we go. Alright, so let's plug in all the rotation values now. And we'll just keep moving along here. Let's keep going. Rotate, rotate, into rotate. All right, one last one. And I promise this will be all over. All right, rotate, rotate, and last one.
There we go. So let's just check everything to make sure that it's working. So we got the FK icons here. So if I rotate these, it should rotate the main ribbon, which it does. That is a little bit off. Let's see what's going on here. Why does that one seem to be rotating more? Interesting. Because the ribbons are rotating exactly the same. They look exactly the same. So let's see, these are all set to 30. What? Oh, whoopsie doodle. Did I miss one? Looks like I missed 4. Why did I miss 4? Oh, looks like I didn't connect it in there. There we go. Yeah, that should do it. Excellent. So now everything's lining up. That'll just look like a quick disconnection there. Sometimes happens, you know, you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. There's a chance you might miss one here or there, but a good a good practice to let you know if you're good at this is to be able to identify problems quickly and easily. So there we go. So we even got a twist here. Twist we can even push past 180 if we wanted to. Now, I had also mentioned that we were going to do a twist deformer as well. Well, if we've got the twist here, why would I need to do the twist deformer? And the reason is I want to be able to have the twist separate from the FK setup. So perhaps if I wanted to twist the control, like maybe I would have an attribute on this icon here to twist the system, but have it not really affect the FK, and the FK can kind of work on its own. That's kind of what I want to go for here. If I wasn't doing an FK setup, um, a twist deformer would absolutely be necessary. So if you wanted to, you don't have to include it, because you do get most of the effect that you're going for with the twist. Um, but personally, I'm just going to include the twist deformer just in case you don't plan on doing an FK system here for a ribbon rig. So I'll just show you the twist deformer as well. All right, so the last thing I want to do for the FK setup here is I want to create those set-driven keys. We're going to put the attributes on the individual icon here, and we'll have it control the icon pads for the FK icons here. So the pad 1's here. So I'm just going to select all these real quick and open up the set-driven key window. Make sure they're all there, which they are. And what I need to do here on the individual icon is I need to create the attributes. So first thing I'm going to do, since we don't actually need to translate or rotate or scales, I might need visibility if in case I want to turn those off. So I'll just lock and hide all the other ones. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a separator attribute so I can start to organize the different attributes to control all the blend shapes here.
So the separator attribute I'm going to call FK, and we're going to turn it to enum, get rid of the blue default attribute, and we're going to call this, we're just going to put a bunch of dashes for the first one, create it, and that's it. And we'll just lock it. So there's our separator attribute. So this will just let us know that we're dealing with FK attributes. And create those attributes now. So we'll call the first one curl, minimum -10, oops, max 10. There we go. And we'll do sway for the side-to-side movement. And we'll do twist. Same thing. Alright, so we got our attributes, so now we can load that into the driver of the set-driven key. Now, I'll go through this pretty quick because we already really know what we're doing here as far as a set-driven key. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's pretty straightforward. You just select the attributes, key it to default, move the driver first. We'll go -10 and rotate this. Let's see how far I want to take it. Probably right about there. Actually, I'll up it to -45. Or maybe we'll just do 40. Alright, that looks good. And we'll do the max curl. See how far we can go with this one. Probably just about the same. Maybe a little bit less. Let's just do 36. That'll be right on the edge there. Alright, that works. So key that. And there we go. We got our curl all ready to go. Let's do the sway next. Key to default. -10 going to the left here. We'll just do like -30. Oops. So we'll key it here. And we'll key it the other way. Going to +30. Let's get the sway. And lastly, we'll do the twist. I don't know necessarily how far we want to go with this. The 60. I think 60 will work there. Key it at 60. And we'll key it the other way. Alright, so we got our set-driven keys all done. So the FK part of the blend shapes is officially done. So we can take that FK setup we have here and we can hide it, so we can move on to the sine waves. Alright, so I had mentioned in the previous video that we are going to do two sine wave setups here. One for the kind of up and down sine wave and one for the side to side. So we'll actually be creating two of those blend shapes and two of those deformers. So let's duplicate the geo here. This is 2. This is 3. Now I'm going to take the name of the FK1. just so I can keep the naming consistent here for these as well. So this is, I'm going to call this Sine Z, because this is usually dealing with the Z-axis, the up and down axis here. And I'm going to call this one Sine Y, so that I know it's side to side. All right, so at this point, all we really need to do is create that non-linear sine deformer. Now, one thing that you're probably going to see here, and this is what I was talking about when I decided to curve the initial geometry here, that it might affect getting the handle into the right spot might be a little difficult here, and it might affect how it's going to move the geometry, because you see it's not going to line up perfectly, which is why a lot of people like to keep the ribbon perfectly flat, but I think we can get away with it here. So let's turn on some attributes here so you can see it working. So that's side to side, so we want to rotate it. There we go. So it's looking pretty good. So you can see it's a little bit off here. It's not too far off. Let's see, the geometry is just a little set apart from it, but it's honestly, if I move this around, you're gonna see it's barely noticeable. If you didn't see the deformer there, you wouldn't really notice much of a difference. So now that we got the deformer in there, we need to actually start adjusting some values so that this actually looks right. So the first thing to note is we want this part of the deformer, or this part of the geometry, to stay put where it is, the rest of it to move. The way you do that is up the drop-off. Now, one problem is you notice it does it for both ends. We don't get the drop-off on just one side. So, the easiest thing to do here is we can move the deformer a little bit, someplace where we're not going to see much of the drop-off. So I turn it off here. Turn the drop-off to 0. And what I can do, because it's taking, this part is getting a little too flat, is I can actually scale the deformer just right to where that point is staying planted. There we go. So now we'll have to adjust the values a little bit higher. But, as you can see, there we go. So we got the sine wave. That's looking pretty good. So at this point, we can start to connect some of the values in, but I want to create the other sine wave deformer while we're at it. And hit the values in. Let's see what we got here. Let's see if I rotate this one over. Let's get similar results if I can. So I'm just hitting enter on some of these attributes so it rounds it to the third decimal place instead of having, some of these will have longer numbers, but visually it'll round it, but it doesn't actually round the number. So hitting enter ensures that it does, in fact, mathematically round the number. So let's see. line there for the scale. Turn the drop off on. So, looking pretty similar. See if we can line up the rotation as close as we can to the other one. So it'd be affecting it similarly. So you can see here, if I'm looking at the side view, there's the rotate, there's the z-axis bend handle, or sine handle. So just try and rotate that just a little bit more. There we go. Pretty close. There we go. That's pretty much right on the money there. So ensuring that the bend handles are in roughly the same spot will make sure that it moves the geometry in a similar way. So the amplitude is 0.8. There we go. That's looking pretty good. So at this point we can start connecting attributes in. So what we can do now, I want to try and not use as many attributes as possible. I want to try and kind of narrow not narrow, but essentially limit as much of what I need to connect in here. So really all I need is amplitude and wavelength and the offset attribute. And we're going to include one more for fall off. And what the fall off is essentially doing this. So we'll be able to move the handle out, and so it'll only affect that part. So it's similar to what I did with the advanced sine wave expression, but that uses clamp mathematics to limit it, whereas here we're just going to move the handle. Alright, so we're going to need 4 attributes for each, except I think that with the wavelength, we'll see. I'll add them all for now. I might have the wavelength just be one attribute so that they move similarly and at the same speed. We'll see how it looks, but so I'm going to use my handy dandy tool here. So we'll start with a separator. That's what this is for, and we'll call this Sine Z. So it creates the attribute for me. We're going to float. So -10 and 10. And say on off. This will be essentially the one that controls the amplitude. Oh, so I'll just call it amplitude, or amp for short. And I don't need that to be -10, I just need that to be 0. So we have the amplitude, we need the frequency, and what else do we need? The offset This is where I might keep the offset separately, because I mentioned in the intro video how I wanted to switch up what's going to control the offset here, whether it's going to be an attribute, whether it's going to be the timeline, or whether it's going to be the movement of this control. So we'll see. Let's see how do I want to approach that. So I'll add the fall off here. And that's just a 0 to 10 as well. Alright, so what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to include an attribute to control the offset manually, and then a second attribute to switch what controls that offset attribute. So I'll have one attribute to move it, and then I'll have a second attribute, probably an enum attribute, that will have the different objects that are going to control this specific offset value. All right, so we'll start by creating, or I'll just call it animation. I like that better. And then we don't want a max for this. So I'll just add the attribute. So this should be an unlimited attribute. Yep. Alrighty. So at this point, we want to kind of connect everything in, at least for this first one. So we'll open the node editor, add this guy in. We don't need the actual handle. We want the handle shape. So there's the attributes we're looking for. Alright, and now we're going to bring in this icon.
Alright, so the node that we're going to use in this case to kind of switch the control of the sine wave animation is a condition node. So we're going to use 3 separate condition nodes, one for each control setup. So this one will be for time, this one, or that one will be for the attribute that we created on the individual icon. The second one will be for time, and the third one will be for the center of gravity icon. So I'll name these once they're all done. I just more so want to test and make sure everything's working there. So we have the animation switch attribute, and we're going to plug that in. Actually, before I do this, I'm going to pin these because mine is being a real pain about connecting attributes together. So we'll plug the animation switch into the first term of each of these condition nodes. I want to check in the attribute editor, make sure that they are equal to, which they are. So the first one, we're going to keep at 0 since that's the first option in the animation switch attribute is always 0. The second one we are going to set to 1. And the third one we are going to set to cog. Because I'm pretty sure if we go back to the attribute here, that's the order that they're in. Yeah. So at this point, we need to plug in the values to say when the first term is equal to the second term, we'll plug whatever controlling value we want in there. So in the first one, the value is that animation attribute, so we're going to plug that into color if true R. And we're going to set the color false to 0. In fact, we're going to do that for all of these here. All right, now the second condition here is set for time. So in order to connect it to the timeline, what you actually need to do is the node to connect it to the timeline already exists. So what you have to do is up here in the top right, just plug in time in between two asterisks, and there it is. Once I hit enter, it added it into the node editor. And because you can technically go in and if I hit tab here and just click time, it'll create a new one, but that's not the one we necessarily want to use because this isn't connected to the timeline. So we can actually get rid of that, and we'll plug the out time here into the color if true R of the attribute there, of the condition. And then the third one, we're going to use the center of gravity icon. So I'm just going to add this in here. Don't need the shape. Now, what we want to do is essentially convert these translate values into a distance value. So I don't want to necessarily plug the translate, like combine the translate x and z values into one attribute, because if I add them together, then if it moves in x and z at the same time, like if it moves diagonally, then it's going to double the values essentially and make the sine wave go faster, which is not what we want. We will actually just want to convert these translate values into a distance. Well, there's a very easy way to do it, and that is with the distance tool. So what we're actually going to do is just create a unique distance tool and have one end of the distance tool follow the center of gravity and the other one just follow this move all control here. And that's really all we need to do for it. So we'll create the distance tool and do a little shelf button there. So we got the distance tool, and what we're going to do is just snap these both right to the origin. So both of these are literally right on top of each other. The distance should be set to 0. Let me just move one of these just to make sure. Yeah, there we go. So the distance currently is set to 0. So I'll call this sine distance cog locator. And I'll just call this the master locator, just to let me know which one I'm connecting to which. So really all I need to do at this point is parent the sine locator underneath the center of gravity, or since I have this locator's pad already here, what I can do is just parent constrain the cog locator to the center of gravity. And the other one I don't really need to touch. Actually, I'll do it just in case. I'll just parent constrain it to the master control icon just to make sure. And then make sure I name this. So I'll bring these three back under the locator's pad. So if I move the center of gravity right now, there you go. So now we've essentially converted the translate value into a distance value. So now we can see, now we know as the character will move, it'll create this distance value, and we can plug that value into the sine wave. So with that, I need to grab the distance dimension and hit down to get the shape node. And we'll just add that shape node in here. So I'm pretty sure it's already in here. There it is. Let's just get rid of some of this other stuff in here.
go away. Okay. In fact, locators too, go away. So all we need at this point is this distance dimension shape node. In fact, we don't even really need the center of gravity node. So we've got the distance value here, and we'll just plug that into the color if true R of the third condition. And so we should be able to combine all three of these values together, since only one will be active at any point. So we can just combine these all into a plus minus average node and add the sum total together, because again, only one will be active, so that's the only one you'll see. So plug this into the input 1D, since we're dealing with single attributes here. Out color R and out color R. And then we'll put that output 1D into the offset of the sine wave. And there we go. So if we test this out, right now it is set to the attribute. So if I move the attribute, you'll see it's affecting the sine wave. If I set it to time and then run the timeline, now it's running very quickly. We'll make an adjustment on that. But just know that it is working. And then if I set it to center of gravity and I move this, now we're getting that movement. Now this is really more so important for the side to side, because especially if the character is on the ground, this is going to be more important for the side to side motion, but it's working. So that's the important part here, is that switch that we've got setting everything up is working. And I even like how it's converting the values here. And since we've directly connected the attribute, because by default the attribute on the sine wave handle only goes up to 10, but since we directly connected it in, it can actually go past 10. Now we need to tackle that time value, as you know, it's set to 24 frames a second, which is an awful lot. So what we need to do is actually take that time here. Now there actually is this time unit conversion. I wonder if, let me think, it's multiplying it. Let me just test something. Yeah, that's not gonna work. Just wanted to test to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a multiply divide node in here to convert this into a fraction of the amount. So we're just going to take the output into the input 1x in here, break that connection. And let's multiply it by like a really small number. So let's do the smallest that we can. So 0.001. We'll see what that gives us, and then we'll make adjustments if we need to. So I'll put X in the color if true R. All right. Let's see what we got here. So the good news is that we were able to slow it down. Bad news is it's too slow. So we can increase the number quite a bit. Let's try and up it and see what we get. All right, I'd say still a little too fast, but we're getting there. So let's try 0.05 and see what that gives us.
So you can get an even slower number. There we go. And I might do a play blast, see how it looks in real time, and I can make adjustments based off of that. But overall, looking pretty good here. So we've got the 3 different controllers. And so now we have to make sure to name everything before we forget. So we'll call this, stay consistent with the naming, so CT Tent1, we'll do Sine Z switch adder. There we go. So we'll call this adder, we'll call this time, and we'll call this cog. We'll switch the plus minus average to be CT sine switch. Oops, no, I don't want to enable series. Stop that. And we'll call this time adjust, just so that I know what it does. All right, so that sets it up for the Z value. Next thing I want to do is to create set-driven keys for the fall off, the frequency, as well as the amplitude. So I'll take the sine handle shape here, the set-driven key. No, it may actually be on the sine handle itself. Let's try that again. Huh. Interesting. All right, so let me do it. That's interesting. I wonder why. So it works for the driver, but why isn't it working for the driven? Maybe if I select both of them, we can kind of... Nope. That's annoying. Okay, so the set-driven key window seems to be difficult. All right, so we'll work around that. What we're going to use is a set range node. Since the set range node basically does what a set-driven key will do. So in the value, I'm going to plug in the amplitude, the frequency, and then the fall off. So I believe these are all 0 to 10. Okay. So I'll make sure to set those for the old max. All right, and what we set the new max to, it depends on what do we want the min and max settings for each of this to be. So obviously 0 will be 0, and the max will be
go crazy here. Let's do something like 1.5. Let's push it a little bit, and you can always, you know, lower that amplitude. So we'll set it to 1.5. All right, let's check the wavelength here. What do we want the wavelength? So minimum, what'll break it? So it looks like looks like 0.3 may actually break it. Or 0.3 is probably the absolute minimum that we could go. What's the absolute max here? So we'll do 0.3 to 5. That looks good. So the set range, minimum for y will be 0.3. And the max will be 5. And the last one is the fall off, and this is where we actually are going to move the let's see. So I do want to move it a little bit in translate Y, but mostly in translate Z. So what I might do is for the set range, because I'm pretty sure if I use the set driven key on the handle here, we'll actually get what we want here, which is the translates. All right. So I'll actually use a set driven key for the handle since we're going to be moving multiple attributes. So with that, I'll just make sure we name this. That Siri button being right up there. All right, and we'll plug the out values in. So out value X will go into amplitude. Out value Y will go into wavelength. Let's turn the amplitude on here so we actually get something. And turn the frequency into the normal number here. So it's something normal like that. There we go. All right, so we got the amplitude to where we want it, and the frequency to where we want it. Now let's just tackle the fall off here, and for that we'll use the set driven key. So load drivers. So we'll say for fall off, we'll keep it exactly as it is. For the other ones, since they're going to be on a diagonal, we'll probably use translate X as we'll definitely use translate X as well. So I'll just key all of these for that, just to make sure. And let's push this to 10. And take the sine handle here and just move it down, just like that. Right at the very end until it snaps. And key it. So there we go. We get the fall off.
And everything here is set up for the sine wave for the z-axis here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video here. I'll do exactly what I did for this sine wave here for the next one. I'll kind of skip forward past this sine wave, since pretty much everything we just did for this one, or for this one right here, we're going to do on that one. And then we'll tackle the remaining deformers here. We'll tackle um, the twist, the squash and stretch, the roll, and the other squash and stretch. So now that we finished that, let's move on to part 3. I believe this is part 3, or technically this is we'll move on to part 4, which is completing the blend shapes for the ribbon rig.